Okay, and we're on. Uh, Welcome for all of you that are tuning in to another live community event from Jewish Original Media. My name is Isaac Simon, and today we're pleased to have Sam Hyde. Sam Hyde is a writer, journalist, and political commentator, and fellow at the Jewish People Policy Institute based in Tel Aviv. He has penned pieces for Newsweek, Haaretz, Times of Israel, the Jerusalem Post, Jewish Journal, and the Jerusalem Report. A steadfast communicator, Sam works diligently to break down the oftentimes complex geopolitical situation in the Middle East, helping his readers parse the treif from the truth. Sam, thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm happy to be with you.
Yeah. So the title of our talk, is a direct reference to Zionism, and Israel just celebrated its 76th birthday, and yet Zionism, in its definition, continues to sort of be perverted by the larger world and misunderstood in both an intentional and, I think, unintentional way for those that are just, naturally ignorant and less informed. And I guess, sort of a two-part introductory question. How do you feel, what is the state of Zionism as we, inch closer to sort of the centennial of the State of Israel? And why do you think this perversion of its definition persists?
Well, first, I'll establish what I think Zionism represents for the Jewish people. I think it's twofold. On the one hand, Zionism represents a rebellion, essentially, against millennia-long power structures that assign Jews their proper place in society, relegated to the second class, headed towards the dustbin of history. On the other hand, Zionism represents a revolution or an evolution, depending on which way you want to look at it, within Jewish life, meaning that once the Jews are exiled from the land of Israel by the Roman invasion, over the years, there's quite a few movements in the beginning stages that seek to return the Jews physically to the land, liberation movements. All of them, of course, as we know, as history dictates, they fail over time. And the idea of returning to the land essentially becomes one that's slightly passive, meaning that it becomes not through human action, not through collective action, but rather through passive prayer, meaning maintaining the 613 mitzvot of the Torah. One day, essentially, a savior figure will come, save the Jewish people. This will be a descendant of King David, as we refer to it as the Mashiach, the Messiah, and the Jews will once again be sovereign in their ancestral land. Zionism kind of rejects that notion with some level of deep self-assertion, which is why it could only be possible being born out of the Enlightenment period, really, because that was the call to human action. The reason why I think that there's such a pushback on obfuscation of Zionism, this is the second part of your question. The best way I can do this is by kind of aligning it with another movement of that time period, which is feminism. If you look at feminism, it's also born out of the Enlightenment period. It's also a call to human action. Women, just like Jews, relegated to the second class. There was something about Jews demanding an equal standing among the peoples of the world, which challenged not just anti-Semites, but challenged the entire institutional structure of both Western civilization and parts of Eastern civilization, predominantly the Islamic and Arab world. Who through their own lens believe, in specific hadiths and Quranic verses which relegate the Jews to a dhimmi status. So that was a challenge, not just territorially in that way, but it was a theological and an ideological and a civilizational challenge. The same as women. You've got many people who are against feminism today, who claim to not be misogynists. And they might not be. They might have female friends, they might be married, they might have daughters, but they're very outspoken in their approach against feminism, sometimes for legitimate reasons, sometimes for illegitimate reasons. But when it comes to those illegitimate reasons, it's because there's some sort of challenge that feminism brings to the institutional structures of the world around us. I think Zionism has played a similar historic part. And I think there's nothing more frightening than an empowered, previously disenfranchised community. And I think that that's where the pushback comes from, possibly from educated people as well as ignorant people. And then, of course, anti-Semitism plays into the whole anti-Zionism feature, and there's a lot of ignorance around this, and people tend to, I think feminism suffers from it as well. It's pretty much the two movements in which they get to be defined by those who oppose them. That's not true for Black liberation or for LGBTQ rights or the trans movement or whatever really other movement. But when it comes to Zionism and feminism, especially first wave and second wave feminism, third wave feminism, it's a different story. But when it comes to that, the people that oppose these movements tend to get platformed in defining them rather than those who subscribe directly to the ideologies or the movements themselves.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. So I guess would you, in light of that history that you just outlined for us, you would say that it's no longer an experiment, that the experiment has succeeded because of the success of Israel. That is to say, do we still need the Zionist project as it was talked about, for centuries?
Mm-hmm.
That it doesn't need to be talked about in that way because we now have a state. So therefore, has the definition changed due to the development of the Jewish state?
Well, I'm not sure if the definition has changed, and I still think it's necessary because Zionism carries with it not just a goal, but also an ethos, which is often missed. And as Zionism kind of comes into fruition and becomes successful, you have both internally within the Jewish community and externally outside of the Jewish community forces that either co-opt it or oppose it. Okay, so you have kind of within Israel, let's speak within Israel first, you have the Haredim of old and the Satmar community today who traditionally oppose Zionism. They see it almost as a rebellion against God, an apostate movement that jumped the word of God by returning to the land and craving sovereignty before the Messiah had come. So they oppose it. On the other hand, this all stems from the diasporic rabbinical perspective of Jewish history and what would unfold in the Jewish future. But on the other hand, you have the religious Zionist front, which is not necessarily per se the religious Zionism in America, but there's a very specific brand of religious Zionism within Israel, which sees essentially, and I quote, the secular Zionists as essential for them to be secular because they could rebel against the rabbinical perspective, but essentially as donkeys leading the Messiah. And that according to biblical prophecies, it is essential for the Jews not to just have an independent state, even in a part of the land, but to maintain sovereignty over all of historic Eretz Yisrael, which will spur on the Messiah. So you've got these two different forces that develop within Israel. One that could either be viewed as a co-opting of Zionism, that would be the religious Zionist front, at least of the ideology and the original ethos, and the other side, one that develops opposed to it. Obviously, in the diaspora and in the non-Jewish world, we've kind of already touched on that historical development with Zionism's success. I mean, the reaction to Zionism, the kind of anti-Zionism would only be maintained because Zionism is successful, right? If Zionism wasn't successful, there'd be no such thing as anti-Zionism, which is why it's such a useless ideology, because it really stands for nothing other than opposing something. It offers the Jewish people nothing. It offers the world nothing. And I think it's route very self-destructive and destructive forces.
Yeah. So I think that is a good through line to bring us to the current moment. So before we get to the political front and unpack, I mean, we probably don't have time to unpack all of the truly important layers of what's happened in this post-October 7th world. But where were you? Where were you on October 7th? So let's start on a personal note, and then we can break down the political elements.
Well, I was when the first rocket sirens went off, which was at the same time the massacre was unfolding. I was in bed. I was sleeping. It was a weekend. It was 6:30 a.m. And I woke up, obviously, to a siren going off. This is not intensely new for those of us who live in Israel. At that time, I thought, all right, well, here we go with a barrage of rockets. Left the house, went down to the bomb shelter, took cover there. But gradually, over time, the story began unfolding. I'll never forget, maybe around 10 a.m. that morning, we were still not in the know of the details of what was happening. And this, at this point, had been going on for 4 hours. There was a bit of a lull, a little bit of a break in the in rockets being shot into Israel at that point. So me and my friend thought it would be a good time to run out and get some food, because we weren't quite sure how long this was going to last. I remember bumping into a friend of mine who also happens to be a journalist at Haaretz, outside the Umpam, AMPM. Anyone who's been to Israel will know that. It's a little makolet, a little grocery store. We started speaking about it. He said, yeah, so I've heard, we at that stage, we knew that people had broken through the border. We had seen some videos, but we weren't quite sure the details of how many. And just to give you an understanding of how confused people were, he said, maybe 30, 40 have come through. I responded, I said, I think it's a little bit more. My number went up to about 250. I didn't think it would be in the thousands. That was kind of the shock that happened later that day. But I have reflected it on a personal level in hindsight, because in that moment, you're feeling fear, you're feeling shocked, you're feeling anxious. You don't know where these people are. You're not exactly sure what's going on. So it's very hard to process any sort of intellectual thought about what is actually unfolding. You're experiencing it in the moment. But I did, as I said, in hindsight, have thought about it a lot. And it brought me to a moment in time where I thought about the founding fathers and mothers of the state of Israel and how they lived in two separate realities. They lived at a time when there was no Jewish state, no Jewish sovereignty, and no Jewish power. So they understood that. And then they lived at a time when there was a Jewish state, there was Jewish sovereignty, and there was Jewish empowerment. Over the years, living in Israel, being born in Israel, growing up in Israel, etc., that idea becomes null and void in a way. You're like a fish in a fishbowl. Okay, you take it for granted, maybe in some ways, the existence, but I thought about it, and what I really felt in that moment, unbeknown to myself at the time, was that the state did not exist. We got really a sharp glance into Jewish history, into the pogroms, into what it felt like to not have a state. The government was absent. The state apparatus was absent. The military was absent. The state simply, for that day on October 7th, did not exist. And I think all my fear, all my anxiety, all my shock, all my struggling to comprehend what this was really stemmed from that place. The state did not exist.
Wow. When did you begin to understand the magnitude of, or I guess, let's go back to what you said. The state did not exist. That's something that you have come to the conclusion upon reflection, or that was an immediate takeaway in the aftermath?
No, that was upon some reflection. I'd say maybe 2 to 3 weeks later, I'd say towards the end of October, I kind of landed up coming to that conclusion as I thought more and more about it. It was difficult for me in the beginning, by the nature of what I do for work, to actually think of it, to kind of keep reflecting on what I was experiencing in a personal capacity in that moment, because I had to be very deep inside the analysis, working at a think tank and an institute. I had to be very on the ball for hours and hours and hours a day. So you deal with it as a lived experience in life, but you're also going deeper into the issues which kind of hinders your ability to immediately start from. So I'd say maybe end of October, beginning of November was the first time I reached that round conclusion of where it all stemmed from. And that was the feeling. I don't know if it was like that for other Israelis or for the country as a collective. I can't speak to that. I can only speak to what it was for me.
Yeah. What, as you began to analyze, so on a professional level, how have you begun to both explain and compartmentalize both what has happened and how Israel has responded to what's happened? What I mean,
Yeah.
what took place on October 7th was, I mean, you mentioned a pogrom. I mean, we oftentimes talk about the November pogrom as like a modern pogrom. And what took place on October 7th, which I call, the October pogrom, is, more Jews were individually targeted and murdered on that day since any day since the Holocaust. And the, and, understanding and framing the attack in that light, I think, is significant. But I'm curious how you've begun to unpack this moment, not only on the level of a pogrom, but on a larger geopolitical level, and especially leading up to the war.
I think for me, on the one hand, there's the internal thing, meaning the relationship with the state of Israel itself. I feel that leading up to October 7th, with the judicial revolution, a promise was already broken to the people of the state of Israel, where the majority seeked to not engage with the will of the people, but rather implement some sort of overhaul of the system for the political gain of actually minority political programs. I already felt a promise break with the Zionist project at that point. But on October 7th, I felt that the promise of Jewish safety in a Jewish homeland that the founding fathers and mothers of the state of Israel offered the Jewish people, as well as the founders of the Zionist movement itself, declared, was broken by a government who had behaved incredibly irresponsibly leading up to this moment. Irresponsibly to the point where there was warning signs about this, not about coming from Hamas, but mainly from Hezbollah. On the other hand, it cemented certain ideas that I had. It cemented certain ideas I previously understood and believed, but were even national project and its aspirations. So it was a contrast. It was a contrast of coming to terms with things from a Zionist perspective, from its perspective within the state of Israel, and also a realization that a lot of the feelings I'd had, or a lot of the things I'd written about before, about the core crux of the conflict, which I'd always believed. I never write anything unless I truly believe it or could back it up in some way. But October 7th, it became more and more clear to me as to what the representation of the Palestinian National Project is all about. And that was kind of something that it was like simultaneously having to deal with worldviews being shattered and being confirmed, and you weren't quite sure how to balance them.
Yeah. Unpack that a little more. What were your thoughts on the Palestinian National Project before October 7th? And what are your thoughts now?
I think my thoughts are largely confirmed, to be honest. In the sense of, I say, a conflict between two peoples is never really actually in history, when you really look at the deeper issues beyond the kind of surface level things, never really fought over territory or food or resources or the right to acquire property. This is not why people fight conflicts, especially not ones that last nearly a century. People fight conflicts over the ideas in their head. And I think at the bottom line, where everything stems from in this conflict, is two intractable ideas. The ideas that have persisted. These are two ideas that cannot be split and cannot be divided. It is, on the one hand, the Jews want a state, and on the other hand, the Palestinians want the Jews to not have that state. And I think everything that we have seen from the 1920s to today, including a military occupation, including the building of settlements in the West Bank, including different terrorist organizations being born. Everything is a result of those two intractable ideas. So what I came to terms with is that there is no solving conflict until those ideas change, meaning either the Jews decide it's no longer worth it, they're prepared to give up their right to self-determination and live in one state with the Palestinians, virtually as a minority, or the Palestinians do like Sadat did, do like the UAE, Egypt, Bahrain, Jordan, Morocco, and accept that the Jews will be a sovereign people in a part of this land, and they will have an independent nation state in another part of the land. So the issues for me, what became more clear is the issue is not a specific type of solution that's being implemented. The issue is not the different terrorist organizations. The issue is not the settlements. The issue is not the occupation. These are all consequences, results, and outgrowths of the issue, which are these two ideas. So the ideas is actually very simple. The consequences are very, very complicated. But because the conflict is so simple to boil down, it makes it almost impossible to solve. And that, I think, is where the mistake comes in. People say it's a complex conflict. It's actually not complex, not at its core. It's about two ideas that are completely contradictory. And what makes it complicated is everything that is an outgrowth of those ideas.
So is the enemy, so just to take it a step further, is the, when we talk about the presence of conflicting ideologies, I mean, I found it really interesting that throughout, the IDF's time in Gaza, we've seen these reports of finding copies of Mein Kampf in Arabic. We've also seen, obviously, we don't have to parse the details of Hamas's Jew-hating charter, but obviously there's clear, there's quotes from the Protocols of the Elders of Zion of 1903. It sounds like the ideology goes well beyond, goes well beyond Hamas. And that's what makes it that's what makes it incredibly complicated, is that this isn't this is something that's seeped into there's a civilizational element to it as well, which obviously without and I say that without blatantly indicting 2 million Palestinians, and I think in dissecting that, I think, is also another layer of nuance.
Yeah, I think your point about Hamas kind of not being the cornerstone of the ideology is totally issue, which would make sense in the wake of October 7th, is actually missing the boat here. It's an outgrowth of a specific ideology. It might be a jihadist version of an ideology. It might be a fundamentalist outgrowth of a specific worldview, let's say. But I do believe that in not indicting 2 million Palestinians, however, I'm yet to come across, in my work at least, a leader of the Palestinian people, an intellectual that represents the Palestinian people, a journalist that is willing to just unequivocally and easily say, I seek the birth of an independent Palestine next to another state, which I acknowledge will be a Jewish state. To get that sentence out seems virtually impossible. And not just with the Palestinians, but with the international support system. So this is not an indictment of 2 million people, but it is a questioning of the worldview held by the population. There's always going to be there's always going to be individuals who think differently, but yet I'm yet to find him. I'd love to be proven wrong, but I've been trying to prove myself wrong on that point for a very long time. And every time I say this statement, that I've made this statement for about 3 years now, every time I say it, I'd love to be proven wrong, I occasionally will get a DM from someone saying, well, I know of someone who would say that. Okay, wonderful. Put me in touch with them.
Right.
I never hear back from that.
Follow-up.
Or I hear back, and when it comes to the conversation that I have, I notice two things. When it comes to the right of return, for example, it's, yes, I believe in two states. And then it's like, well, okay, that means that the one will be a Jewish majority and the other one will be an Arab majority, a state of Israel next to a state of Palestine. But then the Palestinian who believes in two states also turns around and says we want a full right of return for Palestinians. Well, that turns the Jews into a minority in their own state. So it's not really two states for two peoples. It's two states, but it's two Arab majority states. So even in that case, if you dig a little bit deeper, you get to specific answers which are not favorable, and that's why people choose to not dig deeper, because it can be challenging to come to terms with that.
Yeah. What do you make of the future and the fate of the hostages? I think as of this recording, as of this live, there's between 125 and 132 hostages. And we don't know the fates of if all of those remaining are still alive. I don't mean to say this flippantly. Do you think at a certain point, from a strategic standpoint of war, that those hostages eventually become collateral damage in an effort to complete the mission, whatever the mission may be? And I guess a follow-up to that, do you feel if Hamas were to release the hostages, all the remaining, which they have shown to appear to have no interest in doing, does this war end tomorrow?
Mm-hmm. I think the hostages is a difficult topic for anyone in Israel to speak about. I find it particularly challenging to weigh up the different viewpoints. I remember the first speech that Netanyahu gave, where he laid out his 2 points: return all the hostages and demilitarize, dethrone, whatever you want to call it, Hamas. And I did think to myself, oh boy, those are very contradicting. It goes to what I spoke about earlier, the promise of Zionism. There is a social contract with any country and its people that if they are kidnapped or abducted in this way, you do what you do to get them back. But especially in a Jewish state, in a Zionist state, what that represents for the Jewish people, there's this unwritten social contract in which a government should go out of its way to rescue its people, especially from an anti-Semitic death cult. The other question is, hostage deals in the past leading to Hamas being Hamas or another power being able to remain in power is in some capacity what led to something like October 7th being able to happen. The continued existence of these movements, the continued funding of these movements, them continuing to be able to build. Sinwar was once exchanged himself in a hostage deal. It's very complicated. I think it's very difficult for me to say. It's very difficult for me to say. I want the people home. I want them home with their families. I struggle to come to an actual conclusion on this particular topic because I don't think that we have the intel. I'm not sure if the Israeli government has the intel or the military has the intel. Perhaps they do, perhaps they don't. The reality of the matter is that if the hostages are, God forbid, all dead, then I think the war will need to push on. Because at the end of the day, we've got hundreds of thousands of displaced people who need to be able to move back to their homes. And without the decimation of Hamas, these people cannot move back to their homes. And at the end of the day, if they cannot move back to their homes, it doesn't actually matter if Hamas if Hamas is destroyed. They, in a way, won the war because they would have pushed Israeli territory in, meaning people won't be living in those areas. They'll be living closer towards the center. So you've got two totally contradicting goals. They were always going to come to a head. Now, the question is, what intel? But I believe that the problem that Israel got itself into now is that it has allowed other powers to call the shots on this. And I'll tell you what I mean by that. On October 9th, there's actually a video on my Instagram. I did an Instagram live with someone else, and I shared it. I shared a clip of it where I said, on October 8th, Benjamin Netanyahu should have addressed the nation and said, and the world, we were attacked. We didn't start this war. We don't seek this war. Here's what will happen. These are 5 demands that are very clear that Netanyahu and his government should have demanded of the world. Now, the question becomes, would the world have been able to achieve that? Would America and certain powers been able to achieve that? Likely not, but that's not the point. The point is that that particular moment, people understand the war's objectives and the political objectives. Today, there's very little understanding as well from the media. It's very difficult to come to an actual determination. Now, as I said, I'm not saying that that strategy, those 5 goals, would have accomplished that. But you turn around and you say, if you can accomplish those 5 things by next week, Monday, 7 days from now, there is no need for us to go to war. There's no need for Israel to go to war. We can start this war. We don't want this war. These are our 5 things that we demand after the greatest massacre of Jews in a single day since the Holocaust. These are our objectives. Secure them for us within a week. No need to go to war. But from now, from this moment until then, there's a full siege on Gaza. No one is coming out and absolutely nothing is going in. Now, when I said that, people said that's incredibly harsh. How could you say that? But the way in which the Biden administration and Netanyahu have played out this war for 7.5 months with all these different pauses and all these different things has been far more cruel than that would have been. So I think that people within Israel are fed up at this point. It's about a 30% approval rating for not only because of the social contract, not only because we want our people back, but because the war seems pointless at this point, as if they're not winning and there's no political objectives, which is why Gantz and Gallant have just issued Netanyahu some sort of ultimatum that by June 8th, he has to agree to some political undertakings. Otherwise, they will essentially leave the government. So Israeli society is in a slump when it comes to this right now. Just to end off this, I was out of the country for 10 days. It's my first time I left the country. I switched off. I turned off all my media. I turned off all my social media. I turned off everything. I needed some war continuously. I've needed a break. So I took that break, and I'm very happy that I gave myself that chance to actually have the break. But coming back, I realized I felt it even more than before, the despondency. So I think that we're going to have to start having the political conversations now that go beyond the conversations that we've been having from a military perspective over the last 6 to 7 months.
So do you think that the current Netanyahu, the future of the Netanyahu government, do you believe the country is ability to carry out this?
I'm just losing you a little bit there.
Oh, hello?
I just lost you a little bit. Can you just repeat that?
Yeah. So you feel that the government has totally lost the people's the people have totally lost faith in the government to be able to successfully carry out from a confidence perspective, but also just from a transparency perspective.
Yeah, and I think from a moral perspective as well, I don't think that this government anymore possesses the moral mandate to lead the people through such through this crisis. And maybe the moral perspective is not realpolitik enough. But there are democratic means through which this can be done, and there's historic precedent within Israel, especially in the Yom Kippur War, for example, also in the Lebanon War with Begin, in which governments stepped down, leaders stepped down, leaders took responsibility. I think as we get closer and closer to the actual military operation finishing and the political considerations for day after strategies coming about, I think it is incredibly unhealthy for Israeli society. And I'm speaking now about the people who need to be able to go back home, the people who need to heal, and the state who needs to build. Our economy's taken a knock, all of these different things. I had no faith in this government before October 7th. I certainly have no faith in them after October 7th. I think there's certain ministers in this government whose entire careers have been a bunch of games on social media and inflammatory statements with totally illogical and ludicrous political programs that are contrary to. But my opinion is shared by 60 to 70% of the Israeli public. There's about 70 consistently through all the polls, not just one poll, not just two polls, not just the polls we've been doing at our institute. We do monthly polls, but consistently, only about 1/3 of the country think that this government is doing any form of good job. So you've got between 60 to 70% of the country which are against the government, which is a huge amount of a huge majority in the midst of a war and a crisis that we're seeing.
Lastly, you mentioned you hinted at not the possibility, but you brought up the presence of a hostage deal or a negotiation, and in the past, obviously, that has involved releasing thousands of convicted terrorists in order to get sort of a small amount of hostages. Do you believe that that's a proper price to pay? If that, I mean, obviously, Qatar and other outside countries have brokered a few of the hostage deals that we've seen in the last 7.5 months. But is that something that should not be reconsidered?
I think on an ideal level, it's absolutely not ideal. And in many ways, it's absolutely not fair if you just want to use those terms and conditions. However, I do think we walked ourselves into this position. And this is what I was saying early on when I stipulated those 5 principles. Joe Biden, and I have very mixed feelings on Biden's foreign policy, for example, not just on Israel, but certainly on the region, on the Middle East. Biden addressed the state of Israel before Netanyahu did. They disappeared, and they basically gave the ball to America, to Qatar, even to Hamas to start calling the shots. They didn't grab the ball and play the ball themselves. Everyone took the ball, and Israel may as well be the ball that's just being chucked around in different directions, metaphorically speaking, is what I'm saying. We have put ourselves through absolutely amateur decision-making, total lack of strategy on all accounts. We've put ourselves in a situation so the reality is now that we're in this situation, do we go ahead with that? I feel like this is not a question for me to answer personally. I feel that this is a collective decision. And I feel that the people, for the most part, support a deal with the release of the hostages. That's what I can say. Is that most people, there's more people who support a deal, even at that price that you've mentioned. I don't think that price was necessary. I think that we have put ourselves in that position, especially given that Sinwar, who planned and carried this out, was released in a prior hostage deal. That alone was enough ammunition for Israel to use as a negotiating tactic to not be in this position. But they were nowhere to be found, the government. And now everyone will be paying the price, essentially, for slack decision-making and for, in my opinion, very amateur strategic thinking. So we're going to have to see. We're going to have to see where this goes. I struggle to get behind. I feel different on a daily basis. And I struggle to get behind I can't get behind the Smotrich and Ben-Gvir arguments that they're making totally against hostage deals on any account. But they're not really making that because they're against the hostages or that they're against the deal. They're just seeking settlements in the West Bank. So in Gaza, that's their whole kind of thing. So the longer they can oppose a whole bunch of different things, they can politically turn that into some sort of reality. There's so much going on here with so little sense that I've reached the point now where I actually cannot make, the way in which I spoke about all these issues in the beginning of our conversation. I felt like I had a fair amount of answers, at least logic to my answers, or at least I could draw a logic to genuine assessment of it. I know that we ourselves messed up with our initial strategy and have messed up since then, which is why the only reason why we're having this conversation. And because of that mess up, I'm not sure how to clean up the mess. And that's where I find myself right now. So I'm thinking about it more and more and more. And maybe in 2 days or a week or maybe a month, I have a different answer. But as it stands right now, this is kind of, I can only express feelings and thoughts and where I think we went wrong.
No, absolutely. Well, Sam Hyde, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Take care.
Take care. Bye.